She woke up on the concrete floor of her cell with blood on her hands and no memory of falling. Quick question before we continue. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments. Now, let me tell you what they don't show you about the justice system. They don't show you the part where a 22-year-old college senior with a full scholarship and a 3.8 GPA ends up behind bars because she couldn't afford bail. They don't show you the part where she's 5 weeks into a pretrial detention that was supposed to last 3 days. And they definitely don't show you the part where she starts bleeding from places that shouldn't bleed, and nobody cares enough to ask why. Her name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that 3 months ago, she was sitting in a lecture hall taking notes on constitutional law. Today, she was lying on a floor that smelled like disinfectant and despair, watching her own blood pool between the cracks in the concrete. The charge was assault, a bar fight that she didn't start, didn't finish, and barely participated in. But she was there, and she was black, and she was a woman who didn't know how to make herself small enough to disappear when the police arrived. So they took her. And because her family was still recovering from her father's medical bills, because her mother was working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, because the bail was set at $50,000, she stayed. The pain started on day 12, a dull ache in her abdomen that she tried to ignore because complaining in here was like showing weakness to wolves. By day 20, she couldn't stand up straight. By day 32, she was vomiting every morning, and the guards were telling her to clean it up herself. She asked for a doctor 4 times, 4 separate requests, each one documented in a logbook that nobody would ever read. The first time, they told her to drink more water. The second time, they said the medical staff was understaffed. The third time, they accused her of faking it to get out of her cell. The fourth time, they didn't even respond. On day 35, she collapsed during breakfast. Not dramatically, not like in the movies where everyone gasps and rushes over. She just folded. One moment she was standing in line with her tray, the next she was on her knees, and then she was on her side, and the world was tilting in ways that didn't make sense. They carried her back to her cell, not to the medical wing, not to an ambulance, back to her cell. She lay there for 6 hours before anyone checked on her. By then, the pain had evolved into something else entirely, something that felt like her insides were tearing themselves apart, something that made her understand for the first time in her life what it meant to be truly afraid of your own body. That night, her cellmate, a woman named Rita who'd been in and out of the system for 20 years, looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and said, "You need to scream louder, baby. In here, if you don't scream, they think you're fine." But she was tired of screaming, tired of begging, tired of being told that her pain wasn't real, wasn't urgent, wasn't worth the paperwork. So she made a decision. She wrote a letter. Not to a lawyer, she couldn't afford one. Not to her mother, she didn't want to add more weight to shoulders already bent from carrying the world. She wrote to someone she'd never met. Someone whose name she'd only seen in the business section of newspapers, in billboards, in headlines about corporate mergers and philanthropic donations. She wrote to Marcus Chen, the tech billionaire who'd recently announced a $100 million initiative for criminal justice reform. She had no reason to believe he'd read it, no reason to think it would even reach him, but she wrote it anyway, because hope is the thing you cling to when logic has already left the room. In the letter, she didn't beg, she simply stated facts. Her name, her case number, her symptoms, the dates of her requests for medical care, the responses she'd received, and at the end, she wrote, "I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking you to witness. Someone needs to see what's happening in here. Someone needs to know that we're human." She folded the letter, gave it to Rita, who gave it to her nephew, who worked at a community center that had connections to the foundation. It was a thread so thin it was almost invisible, a prayer whispered into a void. She didn't expect an answer. What she got was something else entirely. 3 days after she sent that letter, something changed in the air of the facility. The guards were tense. The warden was making calls. And someone, somewhere, was asking questions that made the people in charge very, very nervous. The fever came on day 39. At first, it was just a warmth that spread through her chest like she'd swallowed something hot. By evening, her skin was burning to the touch, and her vision was blurring at the edges. Rita pressed a hand to her forehead and pulled back like she'd touched a stove. "You're on fire," Rita said, and for once there was fear in her voice. Real fear. The kind that comes from watching people die in cells because the system decided their lives weren't worth the inconvenience of an ambulance. She tried to sit up, tried to call for the guard, but her body wasn't cooperating anymore. Her muscles were weak, her thoughts were scattered, and somewhere deep in her core, something was very, very wrong. The guard, who finally came to their cell, looked at her like she was an inconvenience, like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person in crisis. "Medical says they'll see you tomorrow," he said, not even bothering to step inside. "Tomorrow?" Rita's voice cracked with disbelief. "Look at her! She can't wait till tomorrow." "Those are the rules. Medical appointments are scheduled in advance. If it's an emergency, she can fill out an emergency request form." "She can barely hold a pen." The guard shrugged. Actually shrugged. Like a human being burning up with fever was just another Tuesday. That night was the longest of her life. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind playing tricks on her. She saw her mother standing in the corner of the cell, crying. She saw her little brother, now 16, asking why she'd left him. She saw her professor, the one who'd believed in her enough to write recommendation letters for law school, shaking his head in disappointment. And she saw herself, the version of herself she was supposed to become, the lawyer, the advocate, the woman who was going to change the system from the inside. That version was fading, slipping like smoke through her fingers. By morning, she couldn't stand, couldn't keep water down. Her cellmate was banging on the bars screaming for help, and the guards were telling her to calm down or she'd be moved to solitary. That's when the warden showed up. Not with doctors, not with paramedics, but with a lawyer. A very expensive-looking lawyer in a suit that probably cost more than her mother made in 3 months. The lawyer introduced herself as Sarah Mendez, and she worked for Chen Enterprises. "I need to examine you," she said, kneeling beside her on the floor, and there was something in her voice, urgency mixed with barely controlled rage that cut through the fever haze. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but her words came out as fragments. Pain, bleeding, weeks, help. Sarah's jaw tightened as she took notes, as she photographed the conditions of the cell, as she recorded every detail with the precision of someone building a case. Then she stood up, walked out of the cell, and the sound that followed was something beautiful. The sound of someone with power using it like a weapon. "You have exactly 30 minutes to get her to a hospital," Sarah said, and her voice carried through the entire block. "I have a federal judge on standby. I have medical experts who will testify that this delay constitutes deliberate indifference, and I have the CEO of a Fortune 500 company who is very, very interested in making an example out of this facility. So you can either get her medical attention right now, or you can explain to a courtroom why you let a pretrial detainee die of sepsis in your custody." Sepsis. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. The warden made a phone call, then another, and then finally, grudgingly, they brought a stretcher. But they didn't take her to a hospital. They took her to the medical wing, a glorified nurses' station with outdated equipment and a single overworked practitioner who looked at her chart and went pale. "This should have been addressed weeks ago," he muttered, starting an IV with shaking hands. This is bad. This is really bad." Sarah was on her phone, pacing, her voice low and intense. I don't care what their protocols are. I want a medevac helicopter here in 20 minutes, or I'm calling every news station in the state. No, you listen to me. She's septic. She's going into shock. If she dies because you were worried about optics, that's when everything started moving fast. Too fast. Voices overlapping, hands on her body, the sting of needles, the sensation of being lifted, carried, rushed. And through it all, one thought kept circling through her fevered mind. Someone came for me. Someone I've never met actually came for me. But the story was just beginning, because 30 minutes later, as they were loading her into an ambulance, someone made a decision that would change everything. The ambulance never left the prison grounds. Instead, there was a sound, a rhythmic thumping that grew louder and louder until it was shaking the walls, rattling the windows, drowning out every other noise in the world, a sound that didn't belong in a place like this. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through the air. And when she opened her eyes, still strapped to a gurney, still burning with fever, she saw something impossible through the window. A helicopter landing in the prison yard, and a man in an expensive coat stepping out like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Marcus Chen looked exactly like his pictures, but different in a way that photographs could never capture. He was shorter than she expected, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too much responsibility for too long. But his eyes were sharp, focused, and absolutely furious. He walked across the prison yard like he was walking into a boardroom, like the guns on the guard towers and the walls topped with razor wire were nothing more than minor inconveniences. The warden rushed out to meet him, flanked by 2 officers, and she could see from her stretcher inside the medical wing the way the warden's face shifted from confusion to recognition to barely concealed panic. "Mr. Chen, you can't just—" "I absolutely can," his voice carried, even through the closed windows. "I have emergency medical transport authorization. I have a team of doctors waiting at St. Catherine's, and I have about 30 seconds of patience left before I make one phone call that turns this facility into the lead story on every news network in the country. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to let me transfer my medical patient to proper care, and then you and I are going to have a very long conversation about how a college student with a bladder infection was left to develop septic shock in your custody." The warden opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus was already moving past him, heading toward the medical wing with purpose. When he stepped through the door, his expression changed. The corporate armor cracked just slightly, and what he saw underneath was something raw and human. Guilt, maybe, or recognition, like he was seeing something he'd known existed but had tried not to think about too closely. "Can you hear me?" he asked, kneeling beside her stretcher. She nodded, barely. "My name is Marcus. I got your letter. I'm going to get you to a real hospital, okay? I'm going to make sure you get the care you should have received weeks ago. But I need you to stay with me. Can you do that?" She wanted to ask why. Why he came, why he cared, why a billionaire would land a helicopter in a prison yard for someone he'd never met. But her voice wasn't working right, and her thoughts were fragments scattered across a floor she couldn't quite see anymore. "Sir, we have protocols," the warden started, but Sarah cut him off. "Your protocols almost killed her. She's going now." They moved her to the helicopter. The guards stood by watching, some with their arms crossed, others looking away like they couldn't bear to witness their own failure. Rita was at the window of their cell block, hands pressed against the glass, tears streaming down her face. The helicopter ride was a blur of noise and motion and pain. Marcus sat across from her, a paramedic working frantically with bags of fluid and monitors that beeped in rhythm with her failing body. Through the window, she watched the prison shrink below them, becoming smaller and smaller until it was just another building in a city full of buildings. Why? She finally managed to whisper, the question that had been burning in her chest. Marcus leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it over the helicopter's roar. Because 23 years ago, my sister wrote a letter from a jail cell. She was 19, she was sick, and nobody came. She died 3 days later from pneumonia that could have been treated with basic antibiotics. The system called it an unfortunate oversight. My family called it murder. I've spent 2 decades making money so I'd have the power to make sure it never happens again. Your letter, your letter sounded exactly like hers. The helicopter banked left, heading toward the lights of the city, and she understood then that this wasn't about her. Not really. This was about every person who'd ever been left to suffer because their pain wasn't considered important enough. Every letter that went unread, every request that was denied, every life that was deemed expendable by a system that had forgotten how to see people as human. St. Catherine's Hospital appeared below them, its helipad lit up like a beacon. Doctors and nurses were already waiting, a whole team assembled in the middle of the night because someone with resources had decided that one life, her life, was worth saving. They rushed her into surgery within minutes of landing. The infection had spread further than anyone realized. Her kidneys were failing. Her fever had spiked to 104.8. The surgeon later told her that she'd been maybe 6 hours away from complete organ failure. 6 hours. That's how close the system had come to killing her through pure indifference. She spent 3 days in the ICU, drifting in and out of consciousness, her body fighting a battle it shouldn't have had to fight. When she finally woke up, truly woke up, clear-headed and aware, Marcus was sitting in a chair by her window, working on a laptop. "You're awake," he said, closing the computer. "How do you feel?" "Like I survived something I shouldn't have had to survive." He nodded slowly. "That's accurate. The doctors said you're going to make a full recovery. It'll take time, but you're young and you're strong and you fought like hell." The charges dropped, all of them. The video footage from the bar was finally reviewed by someone who actually cared about the truth. Self-defense, clear as day. You should never have been arrested in the first place. She closed her eyes. Let that sink in. 5 weeks of her life gone, her health compromised, her faith in the system shattered, all for charges that were dismissed in the end. "I also paid your tuition for your final semester, and I've set up a fund that will cover your living expenses while you recover and finish your degree. That's non-negotiable, by the way. Don't try to refuse it." "Why?" she asked again. "You've already done more than—" "Because my sister never got to finish her story. She wanted to be a teacher. She wanted to help kids who came from neighborhoods like ours, who didn't have anyone believing in them. She died in a cell because the system decided her life wasn't worth the cost of a doctor's visit. So when I read your letter sounded exactly like hers." "When I saw that you were trying to become a lawyer, that you wanted to fix the system from the inside, I couldn't let history repeat itself." Tears were streaming down her face now, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. "I don't know if I can still do it. Be a lawyer, I mean. After everything I've seen, everything I've been through." "That's exactly why you have to do it." His voice was firm but gentle. "Because you've seen the truth. You've lived what millions of people live every day. You have a choice now. You can let this break you, or you can let it forge you into someone who makes sure it never happens to anyone else." She looked out the window at the city beyond, all those lights representing all those lives, and she wondered how many of them had stories like hers. How many letters had gone unread? How many people were suffering right now in cells across the country, their pain dismissed, their humanity denied? And she made a decision. But Marcus wasn't done. He pulled out a folder from his bag, set it on her bedside table. "There's something else you need to know," he said, and his expression shifted into something complicated, something that suggested the story she thought she understood was about to get much deeper. "Something else?" she asked, her heart rate picking up on the monitors. "About why I really came for you. About who you are. About who your father was." And just like that, everything she thought she knew about her life was about to change. Marcus opened the folder with careful hands, like he was handling something fragile and explosive at the same time. Inside were photographs, documents, pages of handwritten notes that looked decades old. "What is this?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "This is the reason I recognized your name the moment I saw your letter. Your father, Thomas Mitchell, did you know he worked in tech before he got sick?" She blinked, confused. "My dad was a mechanic. He fixed cars his whole life." "That's what he did after. But before you were born in the late 90s, your father was a software engineer, and not just any engineer. He worked for a startup that was developing secure communications technology. My startup. I founded it when I was 23, right out of Stanford. Your father was one of my first 5 employees." The room tilted. "That's not possible. He never mentioned." He signed an NDA, a very comprehensive one. When the company was acquired by a defense contractor, everyone who worked on the core technology was legally barred from discussing it. But that's not the important part. Marcus pulled out a photograph. Her father, younger than she'd ever seen him, standing next to a much younger Marcus, in front of a building with a company logo she didn't recognize. "Your father saved my company. We were broke, 3 weeks from shutting down. I was sleeping in the office, eating ramen, trying to figure out how to make payroll. And your father took his life savings, $23,000, and he loaned it to me, not as an investment, not for equity, as a loan because he believed in what we were building and he knew I was good for it." She stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this man, this tech worker standing in Silicon Valley sunshine, with the father she knew, who came home every night with grease under his fingernails and never talked about the past. "I paid him back, with interest, exactly 3 months later when we got our first big contract. And I offered him equity, offered to make him a partner. But he turned it down, said he and your mother were planning to start a family, and the tech world wasn't the life he wanted anymore. He moved back to his hometown, bought a garage, and I thought he was making a mistake, thought he was walking away from millions." Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "I was so wrong, because your father understood something I didn't back then. He understood what actually mattered. He built a life. He built a family. He was there for you and your brother every single day. He coached your brother's basketball team. He taught you how to change a tire. He showed up. And when I sold that company for $1.2 billion, the first thing I thought was that your father had made the right choice, and I'd made the wrong one." She couldn't speak, couldn't process. Her father had never, not once, mentioned any of this. "When he got sick," Marcus said, pulling out more documents, "when the medical bills started piling up, he called me once, just once. It was 3 in the morning, and he was in the hospital, and he said, 'Marcus, I'm not calling to ask for money. I'm calling to tell you I'm proud of you. I see what you're doing with the Criminal Justice Initiative. I see you trying to fix things. And I want you to know that the kid I loaned money to 25 years ago turned out exactly right.'" Tears were pouring down her face now. That sounded exactly like her father, exactly like something he would do. Call someone at 3 in the morning, not to ask for help, but to offer pride. I sent money, Marcus said, anonymously, through a medical charity, enough to cover his treatment, his medications, everything. But by the time it was processed, by the time the hospital accounts were sorted, he'd already decided to refuse the aggressive treatment. He'd seen the numbers. He knew it would bankrupt your family for maybe 6 more months of life. So he chose differently. He chose us, she whispered. He always chose us. He did. And before he died, he sent me a letter. Not an email, an actual letter, handwritten, like the one you sent me. He told me about you. Told me you were going to law school, that you were going to change the world, that you had his determination and your mother's heart. He asked me, not as a favor, but as a request from one friend to another, to watch out for you if you ever needed it. He said, if my daughter ever falls through the cracks, I need to know someone's there to catch her. She was sobbing now, her whole body shaking with it. Her father had known. Somehow he'd known she might need help, and he'd built a safety net she didn't even know existed. So when I saw your name on that letter, Marcus continued, his own eyes red now, when I read about what was happening to you, I didn't land that helicopter as a billionaire doing charity work. I landed it as someone who owed your father a debt that can never be repaid. I landed it because he saved my dream, so I could save his. That's how this works. That's how we survive. We save each other. He moved toward the door, giving her space to grieve and process and feel everything she needed to feel. But she called out to him before he could leave. Wait. He turned back. Thank you, she said. Not just for the helicopter, not just for the hospital. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for proving that someone sees me, that someone came. Marcus smiled, and it was sad and proud at the same time. Your father saw you first. I just kept my promise to a friend. After he left, she sat in that hospital room holding her father's letter, and she understood something she'd been too young to understand when he was alive. Her father had lived a life that looked small from the outside, a mechanic in a small town, a man who fixed cars and coached kids, and never talked about the years he spent writing code in Silicon Valley. But he'd lived a life that mattered. He'd saved a company. He'd raised a family. He'd built bridges between people. And even in death, his love was still catching her when she fell. That's the thing about real heroes. They don't wear capes or make headlines. They just show up. They save each other. They build invisible safety nets that hold us when the world tries to let us drop. And somewhere in that realization, she found the strength to answer the question she'd been asking herself since she woke up. What now? The answer was becoming clearer. But first, there was one more piece of the story that needed to fall into place. 3 weeks later, she walked out of St. Catherine's Hospital on her own feet, her mother on one side, her brother on the other. The news crews were waiting, not because she wanted them there, but because Sarah Mendez had filed a federal lawsuit against the prison, and her story had become the story, the one that made people pay attention. She didn't give interviews that day, wasn't ready to, just issued a statement that Sarah had helped her write. I'm alive because someone listened, but there are thousands of people in cells right now whose letters will never be read. This isn't just my story. This is their story too. The lawsuit moved fast, faster than these things usually move. The prison had kept meticulous records of every time she'd requested medical care, every time she'd been denied. They'd documented their own negligence so thoroughly that the case was practically arguing itself. Within 6 months, there would be a settlement. Within a year, new protocols would be implemented across the entire state system. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was something. She recovered slowly. Physical therapy for the damage the infection had done. Therapy for the damage everything else had done. Some days were harder than others. Some nights she woke up thinking she was back in that cell, feeling that pain, hearing the echo of her own voice begging for help that wouldn't come. But she also did something else. She went back to school. Not right away, she needed time to heal first. But when she was ready, she walked back onto that campus with her head up and her purpose clear. Her professors welcomed her back like she'd never left. Her classmates, at least the real ones, did too. And when she sat in her criminal justice class, when the professors started talking about the gap between the ideals of the justice system and its reality, she didn't just take notes anymore. She raised her hand, she spoke up, she told her story, not for sympathy, but as evidence, as a case study, as proof that the system they were learning about was broken in ways that textbooks couldn't fully capture. The law says we have a constitutional right to medical care when we're incarcerated. The law says that deliberate indifference to serious medical needs is cruel and unusual punishment. But I'm here to tell you that the law on paper and the law in practice are two different things. And if we're going to be lawyers, if we're going to be officers of the court, we have a responsibility to close that gap. Her professor asked if she'd be willing to give a guest lecture the following semester. She said yes. Marcus stayed in touch, not as a benefactor, though he'd set up that fund like he promised, but as something stranger and more meaningful, a friend, a connection to her father, someone who understood both the best and worst of what the world could be. They had coffee once a month. Sometimes they talked about the law, about policy, about the criminal justice initiative he was funding. Sometimes they talked about her father, trading stories, filling in gaps in each other's memories. And sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd been changed by the same man in different ways. "He'd be proud of you," Marcus said during one of those coffees. "Your father. He'd be so proud." "I think he'd be proud of you too," she replied. "You kept your promise. That's what mattered to him, people keeping their promises." 6 months after she left the hospital, Rita was released from prison. She'd served her time and she walked out into a world that didn't make it easy for people with records to start over. But she didn't walk out alone. She walked out to find a job waiting for her, administrative work at Chen Enterprises, in the department that managed the Criminal Justice Initiative. And she walked out to find an apartment, first and last month's rent already paid, with a note that said, "Everyone deserves a chance to write their next chapter." Rita called her, crying so hard she could barely speak. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did," she replied. "You screamed for me when I couldn't scream for myself. You told me I mattered when the system said I didn't. This is what we do now. We save each other." On the day of her law school graduation, 3 years after the helicopter landed in that prison yard, she stood on stage in her cap and gown and looked out at a crowd that included her mother, her brother, Rita, Sarah, and Marcus. Her father wasn't there, couldn't be there, but she felt him anyway, in the weight of the moment, in the significance of the achievement, in the knowledge that she'd survived something that should have broken her, and instead, it had forged her into exactly who she needed to be. Her graduation speech was short, just 3 minutes, but every word mattered. 3 years ago, I learned that the justice system doesn't always deliver justice, she began. I learned that your constitutional rights are only as strong as the people who enforce them. I learned that being innocent doesn't protect you, and that pain doesn't always lead to care. But I also learned something else. I learned that there are people who refuse to look away. People who land helicopters in impossible places. People who scream when you can't scream for yourself. People who build bridges decades before anyone needs to cross them. She paused, found her mother's face in the crowd. "My father taught me that being strong doesn't mean never falling. It means knowing that when you fall, someone will be there to catch you, and then you spend the rest of your life being there to catch others. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be the lawyer who reads the letters, who shows up, who sees people as human beings instead of case numbers or statistics. I'm going to be the bridge my father built, for everyone who's ever been left to suffer in silence, for everyone who's ever been told their pain doesn't matter, for everyone who's ever felt alone in a cell, believing that nobody sees them and nobody's coming. She looked directly at Marcus. I'm going to prove that someone is always coming. We just have to refuse to look away. The applause was thunderous, but more important than the applause was what came after. The students who approached her, who shared their own stories of injustice, who asked how they could help. The professors who wanted to collaborate on policy reform, the organizations that reached out about partnerships and initiatives, and ways to turn her experience into systemic change. One letter had become a lawsuit. One lawsuit had become new protocols. New protocols were becoming policy changes. And policy changes, slowly but surely, were becoming the bridge between the justice system we have and the justice system we need. It wasn't enough, would never be enough. There were still people suffering in cells right now, their pain ignored, their humanity denied. But it was something. It was movement. It was proof that one person refusing to stay silent could start a ripple that became a wave. 5 years after the helicopter, she opened her own practice. Small at first, just her and Sarah, who'd left Chen Enterprises to partner with someone who'd lived the reality they were fighting to change. They took cases nobody else wanted, the ones without money, without power, without hope. And they won more than they lost because they understood something that fancy law firms never quite grasped. The law is only as good as the people willing to fight for it. Marcus funded the practice's first 2 years, refused to take any credit, and showed up to their opening with a bottle of champagne and a photograph, the one of him and her father from all those years ago. He'd want you to have this. He'd want you to remember where you came from, what you survived, and why it matters. She hung the photograph on her office wall, right above her desk, where she could see it every single day. Her father, young and hopeful, standing next to a friend who would keep a promise for 25 years. 2 men who understood that the connections we build, the promises we keep, and the people we choose to save, that's what survives us. That's what changes the world. Late at night, when she was working on a brief or preparing for trial, she would look at that photograph and remember. Remember the cell. Remember the pain. Remember the moment she decided to write a letter to a stranger, because hope was the only thing she had left. And she would remember the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the air, the sound of someone coming for her when the system had decided she didn't matter, the sound of a promise being kept. She would remember, and then she would get back to work, because there were more letters to read, more people to see, more bridges to build between the world as it is and the world as it should be. Her father had saved a company. That company had saved her, and now she was saving everyone she could reach. That's how it works. That's how we survive. That's how we turn our worst moments into our greatest purpose. We save each other, and we never, ever stop showing up. Because somewhere, right now, someone is writing a letter. Someone is in pain. Someone is believing that nobody sees them and nobody's coming. And they need to know the truth. Someone is always coming. We just have to refuse to look away. That's the promise. That's the bridge. That's the truth that survives everything else. We save each other. And love, real love, the kind that builds invisible safety nets and keeps impossible promises, never stops reaching across time and space and even death itself to catch us when we fall. Her father knew that. 10 years after the helicopter landed in that prison yard, she sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon, sorting through the day's mail. The practice had grown. 5 attorneys now, a full-time investigator, a paralegal team that worked miracles with impossible deadlines. They'd won cases that changed precedent. They'd freed people who'd been abandoned by the system. They'd become exactly what she'd promised in that graduation speech, the people who showed up. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Turn on the news, Channel 7. She grabbed the remote, switched on the small TV in the corner of her office. A press conference was starting. The governor, the attorney general, and Marcus standing slightly to the side, looking uncomfortable in the spotlight as always. "Today, I'm proud to announce the Thomas Mitchell Act," the governor said, and her breath caught in her throat. Her father's name. They'd named it after her father. "This legislation will require all correctional facilities in the state to implement mandatory medical screenings within 24 hours of any inmate request. It will establish independent medical review boards. It will create a system of accountability that ensures what happened to Miss Mitchell never happens again." The camera panned to Marcus, who stepped to the microphone. "Thomas Mitchell was my friend. He was a man who believed that we save each other. That's not just a nice idea, it's a mandate. It's our responsibility. This law is named after him because he spent his life building bridges between people, and his daughter has spent the last decade proving that those bridges can hold us all." She was crying before she even realized it, her hand pressed against the TV screen like she could reach through and touch her father's name displayed there for everyone to see. Not as a victim, not as a statistic, but as someone who mattered, someone whose life had meaning that echoed forward into policy and law and real, measurable change. Her mother called 30 seconds later, sobbing so hard she couldn't form words, just the sound of joy and grief tangled together, the sound of a woman seeing her husband's name honored a decade after his death. "He'd be so proud, baby," her mother finally managed. "He'd be so proud of you." "He'd be proud of all of us, Mama. This isn't just me, this is everyone who refused to look away." That night, Rita came by the office with takeout and wine, and they sat on the floor like they used to sit on that cell floor all those years ago, except now they were surrounded by law books instead of concrete, by hope instead of despair. "You know what's wild?" Rita said, refilling their glasses. 10 years ago, I was screaming at guards through bars, begging them to help you. Today, those same guards have to follow protocols named after your father. That's not just justice, that's poetry." "That's what happens when we refuse to stay silent," she replied, "when we turn our pain into purpose." Rita raised her glass. "To Thomas Mitchell, the mechanic who saved a tech company, raised a warrior, and changed the system from beyond the grave." They drank to that, to her father, to the impossible chain of events that had started with a loan 25 years ago and ended with legislation that would save lives, to the butterfly effect of kindness, of promises kept, of people choosing to see each other as human. The next morning, she arrived at the office to find a letter waiting on her desk. Not an email, an actual letter, handwritten, the envelope addressed in shaky script. She opened it carefully, and as she read, her eyes filled with tears for the second time in 2 days. "Dear Miss Mitchell, my name is Jasmine. I'm 24 years old, and I'm writing this from a county jail in the northern part of the state. I've been here for 6 weeks. I'm sick. I've asked for help 4 times. They keep telling me to wait. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if it will even reach you. But I heard about you, about what happened to you, about the helicopter, about the law they just passed with your father's name. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm just asking you to witness. Someone needs to know what's happening here. Someone needs to see that I'm human. If you're reading this, it means someone cared enough to pass it along. And if someone cared enough to pass it along, maybe that means I'm not as alone as I feel right now. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for turning your pain into something that might save the rest of us. Sincerely, Jasmine." She read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking with the weight of recognition, the terrible symmetry of history threatening to repeat itself despite everything they'd done, every law they'd passed, every promise they'd kept. Then she picked up her phone and called Sarah. "We have a case," she said, "and we need to move fast." "How fast?" Sarah asked. "Helicopter fast." Sarah understood immediately. "I'll make the calls. What do you need?" "I need a medical team, a federal judge, and a news crew. And Sarah, I need them now." Within 3 hours, they were in a car heading north. Within 6 hours, they were standing in a warden's office. And this warden, unlike the one from a decade ago, had learned from the past, had seen the lawsuits, the legislation, and the cost of indifference. When they demanded to see Jasmine, demanded immediate medical evaluation, demanded transfer to proper care, he didn't argue. He complied. Because that's what the Thomas Mitchell Act had changed, not just the protocols on paper, but the calculation people made about whether a life was worth the inconvenience. Now, the inconvenience of ignoring someone was greater than the inconvenience of helping them. They found Jasmine in a cell that looked too much like the one she remembered. But this time, the ending was different. This time, there was no helicopter. There didn't need to be. There was just a lawyer who showed up, a system that had been forced to care, and a young woman who got the medical attention she needed within hours instead of weeks. Jasmine cried when she saw her, actually cried. "You came," she whispered. "You actually came." "Someone came for me once," she replied, kneeling beside the medical gurney as paramedics checked Jasmine's vitals. "Now I come for everyone else. That's how this works. We save each other." She stayed with Jasmine through the hospital admission, through the first round of tests, through the terrifying wait for results that came back showing early intervention had caught the infection before it became life-threatening. She stayed because someone had once stayed for her, and because that's what you do when you understand that every person matters, every story deserves a witness, every letter deserves a response. When Jasmine was stable, when her mother had arrived and was holding her hand with the fierce grip of someone who'd almost lost everything, she stepped into the hallway and called Marcus. "Another one," she said simply. "Another save," he replied, and she could hear the exhaustion and pride in his voice. "How many is that this year?" 47. 47 people who wrote letters, who asked for help, who needed someone to see them. Your father would be proud. He'd say we're just getting started. And they were. Because the Thomas Mitchell Act had passed in one state, but there were 49 others. Because one law was progress, but it wasn't revolution. Because as long as there were cells and cages, as long as there were people whose humanity could be dismissed with paperwork and protocols, the work would never be finished. But here's what had changed. The letters were being read now. The cries for help were being heard. The bridges her father had started building 25 years ago were holding more weight than anyone could have imagined. That night, she went home to her apartment. Nothing fancy, just a small place in the city where she could see the lights and remember that each one represented a life, a story, a person who mattered. She made tea, sat by the window, and pulled out her father's letter again, the one Marcus had given her in the hospital. She'd read it 1,000 times, but tonight she needed it again. Being strong enough to ask for help is the bravest thing a person can do. Her father had known that she would fall, that she would need catching, that the world would try to convince her she was alone, and he'd built a bridge anyway, had saved a company, kept a friendship, planted seeds that would bloom into helicopters and legislation and a practice that saved lives. She thought about Jasmine, safe in a hospital bed, her infection caught in time. She thought about the 46 others this year alone. She thought about all the letters she'd read, all the people she'd witnessed, all the times she'd shown up because someone had once shown up for her. And she thought about the letters still being written, the ones sitting in cells right now, being folded by shaking hands, being passed from person to person through invisible networks of hope and desperation. Letters that would find their way to her desk, to her email, to her phone. Letters that all said the same thing in different words. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm just asking you to witness. Someone needs to know I'm human. She would read every single one, would respond to every single one, would show up for every single one she could reach, because that was the promise. That was her father's legacy. That was the bridge that connected past to present to future. We save each other. It's not easy. It's not simple. It's exhausting and heartbreaking, and sometimes it feels like trying to empty an ocean with a teaspoon. But it's everything. It's the whole point. It's the reason we're here. She finished her tea, turned off the lights, and went to bed knowing that somewhere tonight, someone was writing a letter. Someone was in pain. Someone was hoping against hope that someone would see them, that someone would care, that someone would come. And in the morning, she would wake up and prove them right. Because the helicopter had landed 10 years ago, but it never really left. It was still there in every case she took, every call she answered, every person she refused to give up on. Still there in the sound of her father's voice echoing across time. We save each other. That's the truth. That's the bridge. That's the promise that survives everything else. Someone is always coming. We just have to refuse to look away. If you made it this far, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if this story moved you, remember, there are real people in real cells right now who need real help. The letters are real. The pain is real. The need for witnesses is real. Be the person who shows up. Be the bridge someone else needs to cross. That's how we change the world. One letter, one person, one moment of refusing to look away at a time. Thank you for witnessing this story.